Word Balloon is brought to you by the League of Word Balloon Listeners. Coming February 21st, it's Faye and the Moon, the latest graphic novel from Franco and the Saturn Sisters. Faye, mourning for her missing mother, sits night after night below the moon that her mother loved dearly. One night she discovers she can pluck the moon out of the star-filled sky. Back safe in her house, she holds it close, feeling comfort at last. Then Faye loses the moon and finds that taking it has awakened ancient monsters, rats, dragons, and more, who hunt for it for themselves. Will Faye be able to reclaim the moon, find her own inner strength, and save the world from eternal darkness? Faye and the Moon comes from the minds of Franco, whose works include Tiny Titans, Superman of Smallville, Archimaniacs, Itty Bitty Hellboy, and The Ghost and the Owl, and art from the Saturn Sisters, whose animated works include Sesame Studios' The New Neighbors, Hulu's The Awesomes by Seth Meyers, and PBS's Mira, Selkie from the Sea. Pre-order Faye and the Moon now. Available in bookstores and comic shops everywhere, February 21st.
This Superman portrait is really a send-up of the original Fleischer cartoon intro, where you saw a quick explanation of the destruction of Krypton, the rocket ship coming to Earth, and the pose of Superman with fists on hips, where he's kind of looking down a little bit. This is an exaggeration of that, where I'm getting my traditional kind of Alex Ross low angle looking up the body kind of shot, which again I'll credit to Neil Adams as an influence. This is really just connecting with the most fundamental kind of influence in my life from that cartoon shaping the way that I illustrate Superman. It also connects in ways I'd never even thought about when I was doing the piece with one of the most famous images that Steve Rude did in World's Finest of Superman, where he kind of recreated that Fleischer moment with his painted figure of Superman, and then I would spend the rest of my career pretty much doing what he did before me.
Welcome back, everybody. It's time again for Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. John Suntress here, always happy to welcome Dave Gibbons back to Word Balloon. Great to see you, Dave.
It's great to be here, John. Always good to see you as well.
And congratulations. We're here to talk about your anecdotal autobiography, Confabulation.
Yep.
You were kind enough to send me an advanced PDF, and I thank you for that. And it's great, Dave. It feels like reading it like we're spending an afternoon and I'm hanging out with a brew and you're telling me your stories. It's fantastic.
Well, that's great, because that's just how I wanted it to feel. I wanted to do it very much in my voice. And a couple of other people have said that, actually. It's a bit like having me sat next to them. I've always loved to tell a good story, and I feel very comfortable doing that. And many of these stories I've kind of polished over the years through actually sitting next to people in a bar, So it's good to be able to share that at home feeling with all the interested readers.
I don't know if you remember, Dave, but maybe 7 years ago, it was New York Comic Con. We ran into each other outside, and you were so great. And you told me, "Oh, it's funny. I just heard your Tony Hendra interview, and
Right.
you told me you were working on your autobiography." And you told me a truncated version of what you put in the book about Tony Hendra.
Sure, because I used to be at school with Tony Hendra's younger brother, Martin, and he was one of the few people around in those days who shared my love of kind of comics. And he and I used to go after school, and we particularly would look for Jack Kirby, Challengers of the Unknown, and Race for the Moon, and all those kind of mid-50s, early 60s books. And I did get to say hello to his brother, who, of course, went on to be one of the founders of the National Lampoon, and actually is in the Spinal Tap movie as the band's manager. And how he played a crucial part in my bigger history is he was a big fan of Bob Dylan, and I'd never really heard Bob Dylan before. And me and his younger brother Martin played the Highway 61 Revisited album and absolutely loved it. And I said to Martin, "Oh boy, can I borrow it? I have to listen to that again." He said, "Well, you'll have to ask my brother." So I went into Tony Hendra, who was quite an imposing figure, 5 or 6 years older than us. And I said, "Is it okay if I borrow that Bob Dylan record?" And he said, "Yep, sure. But if you scratch it, I'm going to fucking kill you." So the significance of that particular album is it's got the song Desolation Row on it, which is, of course, where the very beginning of Watchmen comes from. At midnight, all the agents and the superhuman crew go out and round up everyone who knows more than they do. So that must have struck a little chord in me then. And I know it did elsewhere with Alan. So I can sort of trace Watchmen in a way back to knowing Tony Hendra briefly.
That's so great, man. And Watchmen, of course, it was funny, Dave. We talked before Watchmen came out, and you were very obviously careful what you said about it then, and your reaction to it. There are tons of great Watchmen anecdotes throughout the book, and unfortunately, you also really go into detail how things kind of fell out between you and Alan. And we're all bummed as fans, but I'm really glad that now the truth can be told, not just about, unfortunately, the breakup of Alan, but your feelings of when Watchmen would come back, and whether it was the movie or before Watchmen, the various things, and also a lot of things that didn't happen as well. And it's great. I mean, that you really go into that kind of detail about some of that aspect of Watchmen.
Yeah, well, of course, I did write a previous book called Watching the Watchmen, which was really a kind of hands-on book about the nuts and bolts and the actual logistics of producing it and the way we went about it creatively. So I'd said a lot about Watchmen there, but I hadn't dwelt on any of the, less joyful aspects of it because it wasn't really appropriate to that book. But when I came to write my autobiography, I thought, I've really got to address these issues. And there's been a lot of speculation online. Alan said some things publicly online, which I disagreed with. Not to say he was wrong, but it didn't match what I was seeing. And I was very tempted to respond at that time. But then I thought, this is just going to turn into some kind of internet spat. So what I would rather do is when I'm in control of the time and space is just put down the way I saw it happening. Absolutely no wish to upset Alan at all or open old wounds. But if you're going to write an autobiography, you've got to be honest. You've got to address things. So I did do that. And there are other things about Watchmen, as you say, that I'd never said publicly before that I thought, well, for the sake of the record, I should really say this because it does give people the full picture. But it's a comparatively small part of the book. I mean, there are things that I go into in much greater length, things of much more significance that I go into, much less significance that I go into in great detail. But I just felt that was something that I had to do. That was really a price to pay for doing an autobiography.
Agreed. The stories you tell beyond Alan and Watchmen, collaborations with Frank Miller and Mark Miller and again, I think we get great insight on your feelings of these relationships and collaborations, but also just great stuff like I got to bring this one up, man. This is great. This is I assume an early kids drawing of yours.
It was, I did it last week actually. No. It's I don't know. I must have been 10, 11, 12, something like that. I had a pen pal. A guy called John Hudson, who was a young English guy like me. And we both responded to a letter that had been printed in the Eagle, which was, one of the most popular boys' comics of the 1950s. And we'd both written to a guy in South Africa who'd written a letter to the Eagle saying that he published an amateur magazine about comics. And we both independently thought, me and John Hudson, wow, I'd love to see that magazine. And we both independently wrote off for it, and we both got a copy back. And the publisher of it put us in touch with each other. So we had quite a long sort of pen pal correspondence where he was an artist as well, and we would draw our own characters and send each other the front cover of the first issue of, I don't know, X the Unknown or The Golden Eagle. And we kept each other's enthusiasm going for a long time. We didn't actually meet until a lot later, when I was at the point of wanting to break into comics. And I came, it's a long story that really you should read the autobiography for. But yeah, from that very early age, 11 or 12, I was drawing things, creating characters, sending them to other people, collaborating with other people. We did a fantastic crossover between my cast of characters and John's cast of characters, where they actually met. And it almost felt like being in real comics, and certainly gave me a taste for it.
See, it's so easy now. Hey, I'm an example of it, doing a podcast and doing it online. But there was a real effort in terms of fan art, fanzines, and putting it, collaborating in that way. You know, in the pre-digital era that you and I grew up in.
Yeah, I mean, it was a great time. If you wanted to get into print, you could get into print quite cheaply. But a lot of the fanzines of those times were actually printed using a thing called a mimeograph, which was a thing that it sounds like some sort of Victorian sort of weird clockwork way of doing things. But you make like a kind of stencil thing, and you draw on it, and you could print it in green or red or blue, and you try and match the pages up so you could get it more or less in full color. And then you would sell it probably at a loss for fellow fans. But back in those days, when you did tend to be, as I was, with the exception of just a couple of friends like Martin Hendra, who we spoke about, very few people had any love of comics. Everybody grew out of them when they were 8 or 9 or 10. So fellow fans were few and far between, not like now, where you can be in instant communication with millions of them, I guess. And so if you found somebody who shared the same interests, you really got a really good friendship and correspondence going. And indeed, it seems hard to believe, but there was a guy in the States that I was put in touch with, a guy called Jerry Pritchett, in case you're listening out there somewhere, Jerry. And he used to send me spare comics. He would send me parcels of American comic books hot off the stands. There was a guy in England as well who would do the same thing. John Hudson, my top, pen pal, I remember coming back from a school camping trip and being absolutely exhausted and having sore feet and everything. And there waiting for me was a Batman comic from 1946 or something that he saved up to and bought, and he thought I would like to read it as well. So he was lending it to me through the mail, which was an incredible thing. And it really brought my spirits up after having spent a weekend in a muddy field, So I mean, it was happy days. And there was also something in those days about the hunt to get the new comics. It wasn't like you could walk into a comic store and what's going to be released every week. You'd have to scour the countryside on your bicycle and try and find the shops that had the latest issues of the comics. And again, they wouldn't have anything like, say, every comic that DC published that month. They might one month, the next month they wouldn't. So you had to it was like detective work. And then when you went on holiday, vacation at the seaside, you would run into big stashes of comics that had never made it to your local comic shop, but had been found in the back of the warehouse and sent to the seaside town where they knew there would be lots of kids very bored with lots of money to spend. And so that was also a good hunting ground. So there was that real world thrill of the chase and real world friendships going on as well, which were, tremendously exciting.
That's the great thing about this book. You really do give a history of your own fandom in general, from those early days through your experiences going to San Diego for the first time, and later years writing the keynote speech for the Eisner Awards, and your relationship with Will. I had that same feeling of the hunt when it came to. I was a big Doctor Who fan from when Chicago Public Television was running the Tom Baker stuff and the Pertwee stuff. And then I found Doctor Who magazine, and it was great to hunt down and find your stories of Tom Baker. And also, it is really interesting, Dave, that we've talked about, your association with Doctor Who as a fan and as a professional before, but some of the things that you were most known for And maybe I'm being inarticulate saying it, but like your run on the Tom Baker Doctor Who stories that you did,
Mhm.
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we adored it, and you really kind of tell us behind the scenes of your feelings while doing it, and the collaboration and the like.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a long story attached to that. I mean, Doctor Who was and still is an institution in British TV. And I'd been very aware of it. In fact, my doctor was actually much more William Hartnell, who was the first doctor. And I do remember literally hiding behind the sofa. And it was made all the more weird because it was in black and white, very scratchy, spotty black and white. So it almost had a Victorian feel to it. And when I came to do Tom Baker, to be honest with you, I hadn't followed the show much. And so I came to it a bit new, but I could see that Tom was a wonderful character and a great character to draw. And it was a chance for me to work with a couple of my favorite writers. And it was working on a character that everybody knew, not like if you say I'm working on, I don't know, even Green Lantern or I don't know, Judge Dredd. People had kind of heard of it, but everybody had heard of Doctor Who. So it was a great thrill from that point of view. And I also got to draw Peter Davison as the Doctor, which was a bit more challenging because Tom Baker was curly hair, big toothy grin, loud voice, extravagant gestures.
Oh yeah.
Peter Davison was a much quieter, much more formal kind of Doctor. Sort of an averagely good looking guy and rather hard to get a good, juicy likeness of. But funnily enough, what I didn't know, and I'm sure as a Doctor Who fan you will, I had reason to meet David Tennant not so very long ago. And I was telling him about trying to draw Peter Davison. And he said, well, actually, he's my father-in-law. So David Tennant's father is also a doctor. So that was quite interesting to find out. The only other Doctor that I've drawn, I did a 2 or 3 page special thing when it was Doctor Who's 500th anniversary or something, when I got to draw Peter Capaldi, who again is quite a good character to draw because he's extravagant and very, very actorly. But yeah, my favorite would have to be Tom Baker, I think, of the 3.
Understood. No, it's Dave. I don't want to. On the one hand, obviously, we're going to touch on some of the stories you tell, but on the other hand, I certainly don't want to go into any unnecessary detail because we want people to buy this book. It's marvelous, and really, I'm glad you do go into such detail about some of these things, and also these wonderful moments of your early career. And this is a big portion, but we got to show some of these images from Tornado Magazine, and. Hey man, good for you, man. Not afraid to do this wonderful superhero parody. There you are, lifting the car. You got the hero pose there, but it's a great story, and I'm so glad, man. I don't know how much of this stuff you've kept over the years. I mean, certainly your own art, but a lot of these articles and stuff. Do you have them all, or was it a hunt for that stuff as well?
Oh yeah, I mean, I've always been a hoarder. I mean, I've still got practically every American comic book I ever owned, practically every English reprint before that. I've still got the first comic book with Superman in it that I had when I was 7 years old. And there's something about it that I suppose you sort of keep your press cuttings as well. I mean, there are bits I cut out of the local newspaper when they did a little article on me, and I thought one day somebody's going to be interested in that. And the whole thing with the Big E, where I'm dressed up in costume, the thing that I really wanted to keep were those pictures of me that you just showed, which came from the staff magazine of the publishers, which nobody outside of that had ever seen. But with Big E, and in fact, those aren't the final pictures. They did retouch me a bit. I think they got rid of my double chin on a few of those and made me look even more heroic. Yeah, I mean, people come up to me at comic conventions as if they've discovered something in the back of a closet that they think I'm going to be ashamed of. But it's just great. I mean, to actually be a superhero and a preposterous, ridiculous superhero at that, and to be absolutely afraid when I'm up on the roof of the skyscraper, as I was, is something that just gives me happy memories. And I got paid for doing it. I didn't do it just for nothing. So it was. I earned as much money as I probably I probably would have earned if I'd sat down drawing comics. So I thought, hey, it's a chance to dress up and show off. Why not?
That's awesome, man. Was it an uncomfortable costume, or was it as you remember?
No, not particularly uncomfortable. I mean, the thing I always say when I tell this story is when I was on the top of the building, which by American standards wasn't that tall, but by British standards was very tall, maybe, I don't know what, 30 floors or something like
All
that.
right.
And
Sure.
I was standing on the roof, and I quickly discovered that when you're standing on a windswept roof, cape equals sail, because the wind gets under it and you feel yourself being dragged towards the edge of the building, hence my terrified look. So I did find out about the actuality of being a Superman that day as well. But no, it was all good fun. I really enjoyed it. There's some other people that might be known to fandom in some of the other pictures as well. There's Nick Landau, who went on to be the owner of Forbidden Planet, and the late Kevin O'Neill, who was a superb comic book artist. He was like the Jimmy Olsen to my Superman. So it was huge fun. It was really getting paid to mess around playing superheroes with your friends,
Absolutely, man. You share a lot of great photo album memories with people like Kevin and the like, and it's really great to see all of you, back in the 70s and 80s. There, someone asked, Smoto wanted to know when the book is released. It's already out, I guess, in the UK, but in America it comes out March 14th, as I understand it.
Right. Okay. I thought it was out before that. Originally, we were hoping that we'd have a release date before Christmas because, as you know, the run up to Christmas is a great time to sell books, but for all sorts of logistical reasons, not the least of them sort of the kickback from the coronavirus and everything, we were delayed. And so we thought we'd like to come out a fair bit the other side of Christmas. So over here, it was actually published on the 15th of February, a few days ago. And I did my first signing at my local comic shop, which was great. I did that on Saturday that's just gone. So the books are out and people are buying them in the UK. I think the UK book trade, again, doesn't release until March the 5th or something like that. And I guess...
I checked Amazon. Amazon says 14th.
Right.
So,
okay.
But there you go. And it's coming out from Dark Horse. And again, maybe it might be in the comic shops earlier than the 14th, yes. And maybe that's why March 5th and everything. Sometimes the bookstores are actually later than we get in direct market.
But anyway, everybody should have access to a copy in the next week or two, and something to look forward to.
Amen, man. No, it's outstanding, and I'll be getting my hardcover as well. You were kind enough to send me the PDF. An Englishman in San Diego, Len, says, can't wait. Safe to say this book is a long time coming. Can't wait to get my hands on a copy and get the bugger signed. Indeed. Absolutely. Yeah. Are you coming over, Dave? Will you be doing any American touring with the book?
I haven't got anything set for the US at the moment, but I'm doing a few venues in Britain. I'm going up to Scotland, going to Glasgow, to the Glasgow Comic Convention. I'll be there for a couple of days and we'll be signing copies of the book there. They've got advanced copies of it. I'm doing Bradford in England. I'm doing somewhere on the south coast, I think Brighton. I'm doing a couple of signings in London. I think I'm doing some signings, or I'm going to be at the convention in Bristol, the Lawless Convention. And I'm really looking forward to it because, what the life of a comic artist is, in broad terms, is you spend a lot of time sitting in a room on your own, drawing or writing or whatever you're doing. And then you spend the odd weekend meeting everybody practically, drinking far too much, having far too good a time. And the bit that's been missed, obviously, with the COVID is that socializing bit. So I've really kind of missed that. And also to speak to the fans, because I always really value the feedback. I love to know what people think, for good or bad, about what I've done. Because otherwise, when you're in a room on your own, you're sort of producing for a vacuum, So I always love to talk to fans about it. So hopefully most people who live in the UK should be near enough to one of these many signings. And I guess depending on how it goes, I may well show up in the States somewhere. It might work for some other reasons for me to go to San Diego, but at the moment I haven't got any plans. And then, of course, there's always New York Comic Con later in the year. But I will certainly let everybody on the socials know when I'm going to be in the US.
We need to get you back in Chicago, Dave. It was great to read that those initial conversations about Watchmen and also your work on Superman started at a Chicago convention. That was, just like everybody, hometown pride. It's like, oh, that's awesome that happened in Chicago.
Oh yeah. No, I mean I think that was the first wasn't the first American convention I'd ever been to, because I had been to one way back in 1973, but wow. it was the 1984 probably Chicago Comic-Con that was held in a hotel out by the airport, as I remember. And literally in the space of 10 minutes at the DC cocktail party on the Saturday night, I signed up to do Watchmen, and I signed up to do For the Man Who Has Everything, the Superman story that Alan Moore and I did. So that was a really good convention. That was a definite step in the right direction for my career. And I got to meet lots of Americans who were, and it's weird, as I say, what you meet people you've never met before in your life. They're the same kind of age as you, and they've all had the same comic book experience, whether they're Brits or Americans or even French or South Americans. It's like you finally discovered your tribe. You're with the people that you fit perfectly with. And so I always remember, Chicago very, very fondly. I also remember that we did go into town for some steak. And I mean, in Britain, we don't get American portions. And this thing that they put out in front of me on the table in Chicago was like a suspension unit off a truck or something like that, with all these bones and meat hanging off it, and, mac and cheese and God knows what stuff with it. So yeah, I always think of Chicago, and it was very windy that weekend as well. So it was everything you'd want.
I don't know did you know that one of Chicago's nicknames when the stockyards were still here, Hog Butcher to the World. So no, it's surprising.
No, I knew that they called it the Windy City, didn't they? But
absolutely, well, yes, the Windy City's the classic one. But yeah, what did you know? Yeah, no, Chicago is one of the cities where you can still get a great steak.
So. I mean, the only place I've been that's more meat centric than Chicago, and I have to tell you, with no disloyalty, I love Chicago, but it was the best steak I ever had in my life was in Argentina. We went to Buenos Aires, and we went in this kind of backstreet place. And I had a steak done medium rare with a glass of Guinness, and it was the most beautiful steak. It was about an inch thick, cooked to perfection, absolutely melt in the mouth. So yeah, I think only the Argentinians can outdo the Chicagoans in their love of meat.
I haven't been to the country, but I've certainly been to my share of Argentinian restaurants across the country, and even in Amsterdam, and always had amazing meals. So yeah, this is good. This is the Meat Hour with Dave Gibbons, everybody. I hope you're enjoying it.
We'll meet again.
But here, I got to tell you, man, I am an Anglophile, and I am always fascinated by bands, of course, movies, celebrities, television shows, but also British comics. And I'm a huge Dan Dare guy. And I love seeing this and your memories of reading Dan Dare, of drawing Dan Dare, and even rebooting Dan Dare. I'm a big fan.
Oh, great. Well, that image you just flashed up, that's quite interesting. If you want to put it up, yeah. It's that's inked by Brian Bolland, who is a friend of mine of many, many years standing. And we got into a bit of a scheduling crisis, and he helped me out by inking some Dan Dare center spreads. So that's penciled by me, inked by Brian, colored by hands unknown, but he certainly did me a favor there, Brian. And it's always really interesting to see your work, worked on by other people, because it gives it a completely different feeling. But I think young Brian might have a future in the comic book business after looking at that.
Maybe. And truly always great to see 2000 AD stuff from you. Here's something from you and Alan, and I love this, and also the inspiration behind it. But it's Chrono Cops, and it's kind of a Dragnet parody, and even in the style of Mad Magazine.
Yeah, well, Mad Comic, before it became Mad Magazine, used to do spoofs of radio shows and things. I believe originally that Dragnet was a radio show.
You're right.
So I'd never heard the show. I didn't know anything about it. All I knew was the mad comic parody drawn by Will Elder, called what was it called? Dragnet, I think.
I believe that's right. Yes.
So Alan had written it very much as a homage to that kind of thing, and I thought, well, that's why I'm going to have to draw it as well. So I did everything I could to make it look like an EC comic. I even tried to do the same kind of lettering style. That's not my usual lettering pen, but I wanted to give it that feeling to it. And it's interesting because I've sold nearly every bit of my original finished artwork, but I kept the artwork to this story.
Oh, wow.
Because I was so proud of it, and it was kind of seminal in the way we did Watchmen. If you look at this story completely, it's about time travel and turning up in the wrong order at certain places, and the older you hiding behind the potted plant while the younger you walks through the lobby of this building. And it's this really insanely complicated thing where there's a lot of Xerox panels and a lot of lettering changes, and it's like nothing so much as issue 4 of Watchmen, where we do the kind of time travel stuff with Dr. Manhattan. And again, lots of Xeroxes and lots of cut and paste and lots of, and so I think it was by working on Chrono Cops that Alan and I both got the taste for insanely detailed 4-dimensional narrative. But yeah, that's one of my favorite stories that I ever worked on, and one that I probably would always hang on to the artwork for, because it felt like a definite, just like the DC party at the Chicago Con was like a turning point. That felt like a turning point as well.
What I love about this image in particular is you've got your enemy, who really is your kind of classic 2000 AD kind of villain and stuff, and then mixed with your Bigfoot parody look that you're trying to do with Mad Comics. I love it. I think it's great. That's one of the reasons why I chose to do the show right now. Beautiful stuff. Too goddamn funny. And also, while we're on the subject of Mad, it's just a portion, everybody, of this wonderful giant scene, and it's very much evocative of what Kurtzman would do in Mad Comics and the other artists. And I didn't realize he provided the breakdowns for Will Elder and Jack Davis and the like. And I mean, you can see this great conversation that ancient Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman are having back, reminiscing about their golden age along with Captain Marvel. This is great.
Yeah, well, this was actually written by Harvey Kurtzman, who I bumped into in a convention in France, and he said, "Would I be interested in working on this new project that he was doing for Byron Price, I believe?" And I said, "Oh yeah, I would love to, because Kurtzman is very much one of my heroes. All those Mad artists were so formative on me growing up." And he gave me layouts as well. And as I was expecting anyway, he was quite a stern critic with the way he wanted me to draw it and what he liked and what he didn't like. But I had a lot of fun populating this full page drawing. Indeed, if you look elsewhere in my book, I talk about how I used to love drawing crowd scenes. I'd create a scene or a setting and just populate it with all sorts of weird and wonderful characters. And indeed, if you want to just flash that up again, John, if you still
certainly, absolutely, man.
You can see actually Watchmen make it into that as well. If you look at the bottom left, there's like caricatured Night Owl and Silk Spectre, and I think Rorschach and the Comedian are lurking around somewhere as well. So it was a real lot of fun. There's Krypton Streaky, and there's Doctor Strange with a beanie cap on with a propeller. And there's actually in the background is the vigilante, the sort of cowboy guy who I used to love.
Greg Saunders, absolutely.
And there's Dr. Fate with his dark glasses on, and there's there's all sorts of stuff. And that was also, as a lot of things in my book are, that was actually coloured by me using the blue line process, which is another insanely complicated and ancient way of doing comics. So I spent a long, long time doing that big crowd scene, but it still makes me smile to look at it. And it was great on all sorts of levels to work with Kurtzman, to work on something that I could do crowd scenes and to do spoof versions of many of the most popular characters I've worked on.
I wish I could have shown the whole thing, but it would have been so small to show here in video, and that's why I
Right.
focused on the portion. But again,
It's another,
everybody, it's in the book. You'll love it.
another good reason to buy the book. If you want the full picture, get the book.
Absolutely, and lots of Easter eggs as far as other heroes
Yeah.
that are in that shot. That is so great, man. I'm looking here. Oh, you know, everyone's just saying hello, and always honored by any time with Dave Gibbons. I feel the same way, and
Thank you.
you know, there we go. I don't know. Let's see. Oh, you know, I don't know if, and I'm not sure about this, so maybe you can tell me about this. Stephen wants to know if you have any comments on the Darth Vader miniseries or Star Wars comics in general. Had you done a Darth Vader miniseries in the day?
Yeah, we did a thing called Vader's Quest. It was written by a Croatian guy called Darko Macan, really good writer. And it was coloured by my friend Angus Mackay, who's coloured a lot of my things from Martha Washington onwards. And it was a real good chance to have a dabble in the Star Wars universe. It was set towards the end of it was set before the third movie. I think it's the first time, it was supposed to be the first time that Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker ever crossed paths. I can't, to be honest with you, I can't remember a lot about the story now, but it gave me lots of opportunities to draw Darth Vader, lots of opportunities to draw the hardware, you know, the Star Destroyers and the X-Wings and things like that. Really, really good script. And it was collected as well. And it's also got a 4-part cover. You put all the covers together and they form a big panorama. So I really enjoyed working on that. And I think, yeah, there have been some really nice Star Wars comics being done, and it's a great way to expand the range of stories. You can afford to be a bit indulgent. I mean, not a million miles away from the kind of stuff that they're doing with the new TV series, where you can fill in areas or you can show off track things that are happening in the Star Wars universe. So yeah, I enjoyed my time doing it, and I've really enjoyed some of the ones that other people have done as well.
You know, Star Wars and Star Trek are like the Beatles and Elvis in terms of, you know, they've got their set fans. I love Star Wars, but I am more of a Star Trek guy. Ever a love of Star Trek? I know Star Trek really didn't. Am I wrong? It didn't really penetrate the UK until Patrick Stewart in the Next Generation years. It seems.
It seems, yeah. No, I mean, I'm of the age where I saw the original series, and I used to really love that because it felt like proper science fiction, you know, and it was well thought out, and it was a believable universe. And it had a sort of a good message. It wasn't about just going around killing aliens or anybody that was different. It was about, you know, kind of peacefully exploring the universe. And I mean, you know, as they say, if you want to send a message, use Western Union. But it did send a good message, I think. And I certainly enjoyed it. In fact, I kind of fell off it when the Patrick Stewart stuff came in, because I was so involved with being a grown-up parent and doing other stuff. Sure. That was one of the things that passed me by. But no, I've enjoyed the Star Trek movies, and I think it's a great sort of flag in the sand as to how science fiction can be and can deal with sophisticated concepts and keep a humanity in the science fiction as well, which I think it did extremely well.
I just wondered if they'd ever approached you, you know, to do any Star Trek comic work. It would have been great to see.
I think I've never had this confirmed, but when DC Comics came to the UK recruiting artists and writers, I believe that what they were going to offer me was Star Trek, because they knew that I could draw space stuff because I'd done all the Doctor Who. They knew that I could do likenesses as well because of the Doctor Who characters that I'd done. But I don't think they ever formally asked me to do it. I would have said no, because it's all right to do one likeness, but when you're drawing Star Trek, there's always half a dozen of them in the same shot. And what I probably would have done was be to emulate an Italian artist called Giolitti. And what he used to do for every page in the Star Trek comic, you get like at least one picture that was just, well, it's like the old Jack Kirby thing, a spaceship with a couple of balloons coming out of it. Then you get a picture where it was a silhouetted back view of everybody looking up at a screen. Then he'd do one where there was a really big close-up, a recognizable close-up of one of the characters with the others silhouetted or really tiny in the background. And then he'd perhaps draw, I don't know, something else to fill it up. But he did everything he could to avoid having to do all these likenesses in the same picture. And that's what I would have done as well. It would have been a nightmare of reference. Although after a while, to be honest, I drew Doctor Who for Dr. Hill. He's my old doctor. Anyway, I drew Doctor Who for a long time. And I almost got to the point where I could draw a reasonable likeness without looking at any reference. But again, the key to that was every couple of pages have a really big spot-on caricature. And then people will forgive the ones that are a little bit off. But you have to keep establishing, this is Tom Baker, this is Tom Baker. So
I love it, man. That's great. Maybe they could have convinced you to do like a solo Kirk or Spock story, so you only have to worry about one character. But yeah, I'm bummed, man. I'm doing Darth Vader. I can appreciate that, I'm sure, from a fan standpoint and the opportunity to draw him, because it is such an interesting design. But Dave, your faces are always so emotive, and I think that is so great. And it's one of the highlights of your work. I mean, the terror in some characters, or the confidence of a Superman or whomever. God, the twisted confidence of Jor-El in The Man Who Has Everything. I mean, it really is those kind of emotional moments that always stand out to me.
Oh, well, thanks. I mean, that's a very important thing to me. And that's why I've always liked to work, say, full script, because I think you have to be able to get the nuance of what the character's doing, not just a generic blank or kind of middling kind of expression. And as you can see from looking at the confabulation book, I do love humor as well. And there's a lot of humorous things in there that people won't have seen before. And giving character is a little bit like adding humor or adding humanity to it or adding emotion to it, So I've always been very concerned with getting expressions right and getting the transition of expressions right, to show somebody's reaction happening and then changing and then moving on to something else. And of course, it's even more of a challenge to get that kind of acting if you can't see the character's face. And of course, with Darth Vader, you can't see his face. With Rorschach, you can't see his face. And you have to do a lot more in the body language and the gesture and the posture, So I've always found it an interesting challenge, that, and I'm much more interested in doing something that, even if it's a little bit crude, has got a believable, identifiable emotion in it, rather than doing beautifully rendered, finished drawings, because that can sometimes go a bit statuey. Statuey, is that a word? Yeah, but you know what I mean.
Statuesque, absolutely. I'm with you, man.
Yeah. So and also, I mean, I like to do it with the characters as well. I mean, with the Watchmen characters, they're not all generic super body number 3 with a different mask. They've all got different body shapes and postures and habitual expressions on their faces. So it's all part of, to me, bringing the thing alive and allowing the reader to identify with the characters.
One thing I loved about the progression of Silk Spectre in Watchmen was it almost felt like you were making her look more and more like the comedian once the reveal is there that she is the comedian's daughter, because she has that kind of cynical, hard look about her that maybe she didn't have in the earlier chapters of the story. And again, maybe I'm misremembering, but that was my feeling on it.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. I don't know if I ever thought that as explicitly as that, but yeah, there is something about her that as a child, she's been very much told what to do and shown what to do, and people have expected things of her. Now she's starting to be her own person. And also, once she's got free of Dr. Manhattan as well, more of her true character is coming out. And she's a tough girl. She's not just kind of an ornamental token woman. She's a really strong, really powerful character. And I think, yeah, that probably, once she's free, is something that I would have emphasized more to show her heritage.
That's great. Lots of stories about the movie and the movie experience as well. Another character of yours that you're associated with, and this is a really interesting chapter. And again, we want people to buy the book, but Rogue Trooper has always been. It's really been more your art. And again, this insanely interesting half dead face on the trooper and everything. I once I saw it, Dave, I was like, this is really, it became one of my favorite things that you've ever done.
Oh, good. Well, I mean, he was a character that I co-created with Jerry Finley Day, the writer. And I certainly had this idea about it, that his curse, the curse of Rogue Trooper, was he couldn't die. He was on a hell planet, on a war planet, and he couldn't die. And he also couldn't stop getting in a fight. He also couldn't stop killing people. And it was to a degree inspired by the old Kung Fu TV series with David Carradine, where David Carradine played a Shaolin monk, highly skilled in martial arts, who'd been thrown out of the monastery and was now roaming the wild west of America, always trying to avoid trouble, but always getting in trouble, always having to unleash his martial skills, whether he wanted to or not. And I thought that was quite interesting. And I always had this idea of carrying Rogue Trooper on to go through the later stages of his life. Like, I thought it might be really good to do like a kind of King Rogue thing, like, you know, in the Conan books where you get his later life and he's now King Conan. I thought that might be an interesting thing, that he'd been that successful on the planet that he now was the king of the planet somehow, to see how that played out. And then I also thought, again, to take another leaf out of an old Pulp Fiction thing, I also would have been interested to see what happened if Rogue Trooper had found himself back at the center of galactic civilization, still with all these killer instincts working, a bit like Tarzan in New York. You know, he obviously doesn't fit amongst humankind. And so this was a thing that I did. I to be honest with you, I can't even remember. This looks like it was done for a fanzine or as a fan commission, but this is Rogue a few hundred years in the future, where he's scarred and battered, his helmet's bent, everything's scratched, everything's worn, but he's still there and he's still reporting for duty. So yeah, it's an interesting piece, this, and a piece that I'd forgotten about until I started to hunt through my archives. But yeah, it does kind of tell a story of what might have been.
I agree. Someone wanted to know the dimensions of the book, and actually, I think they're listed here in Amazon. But if you know,
hold on a second, I will get a copy of the book. Just hold on a second.
Oh, that'd be great. Thanks, Dave. Because people want to know. They're like, hey, man, if this is an art book, they want to make sure that it's nice and big. Okay. And there it is.
Here it is. And this also proves that the book actually does exist. I'll just flip through it. Not every page and every drawing, but I'll just try and give you an idea of what's in it. There's an extensive bibliography. You see? Absolutely.
Yes, indeed. You might want to pull it a little closer to you. I mean, I don't want you to be buried in it, but there you go. There you go. Yeah, it's and everybody, just so they know, did you give any thought, Dave, to make it almost like an artist edition and make it like Treasury oversized?
No, I think this is a really good size for it. If it had been comic book size, it would have been too small. But this is like kind of standard sort of art book size.
Agreed.
There's about 300 and something pages. I think it's somewhere around there. About 100,000 words. There's an image on every page. It's done alphabetically, as we may have mentioned before, which I thought made it more interesting than just being a chronology. They are anecdotes, whereas we were saying earlier, they're just the kind of thing that you exchange stories in a convention bar or something like that. But it covers all aspects of my career, from, you know, the really sort of amateurish stuff or childlike stuff I did. So that gives you an idea of what it's like. And everybody, without exception, has said, "Oh, it's really big, isn't it?" So it's like there used to be a comedy on the TV in England called "Never Mind the Quality, Feel the Width." So this is a good big book, and I think, well, as I said, I tried to write the kind of book that I would like to read. So I still find it interesting. I sat down and read it the other day, and I thought, that's pretty good. Yeah, that's kept me happy for a few hours. So hopefully you readers, when you do get your hands on it, will enjoy it as well.
Yeah, it's anecdotal alphabetically, and that's great because, you know, Dave, my one experience of writing an art book was I co-wrote with Mike Oming his art book for Dark Horse, and in my mind, to make it different, I almost envisioned that we were going through a virtual art gallery, and you know, the large images and stuff, and it was almost like he and I were having a conversation as we'd look at a certain image and things. And that was my thinking. And that's why I appreciated that you didn't just do a linear autobiography and okay, in 1982, X, Y, and Z happened. Things
Yeah,
like that.
yeah. I mean, the other thing was that I could write all the entries to it at whatever length they were worth. I mean, there are some entries that are maybe one paragraph. There are some that are 3 or 4 pages. So I would sit down every morning and think, what do I want to write about today? Well, what interests me today? And I'd write however long the entry had to be, and then I would finish it, and then I'd put it away, and then I'd work on the next one. So it kept it very fresh, and it meant that I was focused on I'm going to do another meat analogy here. It meant I was focused on the meat rather than the connective tissue, which we all cut out and throw away anyway. So that was, I didn't know that I'd be doing meat metaphors this afternoon, but it's good. I wanted to make it different. I didn't just want to, and this is a sort of thing with nearly every project and product I've done. I want to make it look different, do something with the design of it or the tone of it or something, just to set it apart. So that's what I tried to do here.
You know, in the I'm going to try and do the math quick in my head. I believe you and I have had conversations for about 14 years now, going back to when you did that Watchmen art book. I think was the first time you and I spoke. Right. But I've always appreciated that, Dave, that you are always pushing. You talk about in the book that now you draw with a Cintiq. You go into detail about your experience with Madefire, one of the digital initiatives that you got involved with. I didn't know that Liam Sharp was with you on that, and that was interesting to learn. And it's or I guess he brought you into that, if I'm remembering that bit about Madefire correctly. But I mean, that's great, Dave. Seriously, because a lot of people will find they do one thing, they stick with the basics and do great work, but never innovate or think of pushing themselves forward. I know you've been a big tech person all your life. You talk about that in the book as well. But yeah, I mean, that's great that you find different ways of doing your art and pushing yourself forward.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the sort of joy of the new, really, isn't it? And I mean, I can remember quite early on using a piece of software called Manga Studio then. Now it's called Clip Studio Pro or Clip Studio EX. And I actually went to their table at San Diego and said how interested I was.
Oh, he froze. He'll come back, kids. Don't worry. We'll get him. We'll get the story from Dave as soon as he hopefully unfreezes sooner than later. Dave, I hope you can hear me. You might have to leave the studio and come back in, Dave. I don't know if again, I hope he can hear me. I'm going to put it in the private chat as well, everybody. Isn't this great? I could talk to him forever. There we go, David. Now you're moving again.
Well, of course, it has to make you smile that just as we're talking about the wonders of technology lets us down. But yeah, I actually approached the people who did this comic drawing software because it was such a useful thing. And they got me to do some demonstrations for them, which I was really happy to do. And, you know, they flew me over to San Diego, I think, a couple of times. I also got myself a Cintiq tablet I've never really done this in my life before. I'm normally obviously when I'm on a thing like this, all I do is talk about myself and how wonderful I am. But in real life, I'm fairly modest. I remember being at a computer show and Wacom had a booth there. And I said to the guy, oh, you know, your Cintiq tablets that you do, I'm really thinking of getting one. I said, but they're much more expensive in Britain than they are in the US. You know, the US price in dollars is the same as the US price in pounds. And I said, if I bought one in the States, could I get it under warranty in the UK? And he said, no, I'm sorry, it doesn't work like that. And I said, oh, well, that's a shame. I said, because the business I'm in would be a pretty good market for your products. And he said, what business is that? I said, oh, well, I'm in the comic book business. He went, he said, what's your name? I said, Dave Gibbons. He kind of shrugged. I said, I tell you what, here's my card. Why don't you Google me? Which is a pretty arrogant thing to do. I said, why don't you Google me? And he was on the phone the next morning. Hey, Davey, I've had a look at your website. And it turned out coincidentally that the European office of Wacom was about 5 miles from where I live.
Oh my God.
And they said, if you come in and do a demo, we'll give you a Cintiq.
Wow.
So I did. So I got a free Cintiq, free software to use on it. So that kind of worked out well. And as I say, I did have to go through the arrogance of going, do you know who I am? So, but it was worth it, man. I saved a lot of moolah.
Dave, honestly, and this was something that we discussed before Watchmen was out, and when you were hesitant to give more than the general positive statement that you made for DC. But I'm like, the great thing is, Dave, no matter what, that has to be a wonderful Watchman, like carrying card to get you meetings, to get you business opportunities, and not with any arrogance. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe you've heard of one of the 100 greatest, novels of the 20th century. I co-created it. I co-made it. It's like,
sure, without a shadow of a doubt, it's been tremendously. Yeah, I mean, even to begin with, soon after Watchmen came out, and it became known, or I let it be known, that I'd always wanted to write comics as well as draw them. That made that a much easier process because people would see my name. I think they call it a marquee value in the States.
Yes.
In the movie business. Oh, Dave Gibbons. Oh, Watchmen. This will be as good as Watchmen. Well, that's not quite how it works, but at least it would do that. And a few years ago, I was in Los Angeles and I was going with some people doing meetings on a property that we had in mind. And certainly I got the impression that we went through several of those doors just because the people on the other side just wanted to meet the guy who drew Watchmen. And then we were in the office and then we could make our pitch. So, yeah, so it's always been kind of useful. I suppose the other thing I would say as well is that we've talked about the books I've done and they rely heavily on stuff that I've kept or stuff that I haven't thrown away or stuff that I've squirreled into the back of filing cabinet drawers and everything. But there used to be a thing that they said, you should always keep a diary because one day the diary will keep you. And I think that made it more in terms of scandal, being able to blackmail people. But that certainly has been the case. I've made, three? I did the Watchmen, the How Comics Work, which I also did with Tim Pilcher, and the Confabulation. Those 3 books can only be what they are because I kept all the sketches and the notes and the behind the scenes or aborted efforts, So yeah, it certainly has not done me any harm, Watchmen.
And of course recently, and we really haven't talked about it much. We talked about it when the comic was coming out, but the Secret Service, which of course became the Kingsman movies.
Yeah.
And your collaboration with Mark Miller, another great chapter in Confabulation. But if we could for a second, how's it been being the co-creator of Kingsman?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was a different experience than with Watchmen because with Watchmen, we did it as a comic book. But even back in the day when we were doing it, there was film interest in it. We had a meeting with Joel Silver, the action movie guy. And so we always kind of had the idea that it might be a film. Then it looked like it would never be a film because it was, unfilmable, some people said. But in fact, Larry Gordon, who was one of the eventual producers, said, no, it's unfinanceable because you couldn't put a famous actor in it because it would spoil the dynamics of the ensemble thing. And the story relied on a lot of understanding of the superhero genre. But of course, by the time the movie actually came around, the Marvel movies had made a bit of an impact and people were softened up for it. And they kind of got the idea of, oh, yeah, Superman's from Krypton and he's got a secret identity. Bruce Wayne's got a bat cave and he's Batman, so people, had that conceptual information in their head already. I mean, that worked out kind of well. What was the question again, John? Just take me back to that.
The experience of Kingsman and
Kingsman,
the response. And I love the last one. I thought, I'll be honest, the second one a little flabby in the middle, but that's all right. Love the first one. But really, really love the King's Man, the prequel. I thought that was interesting.
No, I was going to say I mentioned the Watchmen stuff to give it contrast because Kingsman was an idea that had originally been discussed between Mark Miller and Matthew Vaughn, And they both sort of went off, Mark with me and Matthew on, obviously with his production company. We all went on our own tack. So there was no sense of one of the things being an adaptation of the others, that the movie was an adaptation of the comic or the comic was an adaptation of the movie. So they both existed as separate things, and which made it quite interesting because the general story was the same. The cast of characters was about equal, but they had different names and in some cases different sexes. And, you know, so it was quite an interesting contrast. And of course it freed you up because you didn't have to adhere to movie continuity or the reverse comic continuity. And it was a really good experience. And I mean, I love Mark's writing, and Matthew does some great films as well. So it's a really good thing to be involved in. As I say, quite a contrast to Watchmen. And I agree in general with what you said about the movies. What I would really like to see is a third Kingsman, because I'd love to see what Eggsy is like when he is the man, when he's in his 30s and he's not the dumb kid off the streets, or well, not so dumb, but the kid off the streets, and he is now the gentleman. He's now the one who has got this, you know, kind of poor past, but he's now living the dream, having been taught by the best of the agents. So I think that could be really, really interesting. That, to my mind, would almost complete a kind of trilogy, you know, the kind of birth of the character, the middle part, and then the grand finale. So I've got no inside knowledge as to when or if that's ever going to happen, but I'd really like to see it.
Serendipitous that you and Mark, well, Mark, I guess, had the relationship with Matthew already. But yeah, I think Matthew's really a great filmmaker, and it was just good timing. And I'm glad that, you know, even whatever part you contributed to beyond inspiration of the movie and stuff. I think it's great. And I love what you thought of. Is it Temer and Edgerton? I never want to say, or Egerton. I don't know how to say his name properly.
Edgerton, I would say.
Okay, and
Egerton. Do you know? You got me wondering what it is. I'm sure it's Edgerton. But yes, so I was going to say something else about that as well.
About Kingsman.
About Kingsman. No, it'll come back to me anyway.
Okay, man. No worries. While we're waiting, our Burrow Snake wanted to know what it was like working with Snyder. I saw you guys on the press junket for the Watchmen thing in San Diego when they had the San Diego, or in San Francisco, and now it's in Anaheim. I'm forgetting the name of the con that was.
Oh, good. It's not just me then.
No, absolutely, man.
No, I mean, Zack Snyder was great to work with. You know, we got to spend a fair bit of time together. I mean, I remember being given the tour of the set by his wife, Debbie, and they had all my artwork up on the wall as reference, and they had a full-scale owl ship, and they had Dryberg's New York City brownstone, and it was just amazing. They timed my visit to the set so that it would be the one where all the characters were in costume as was it the Minutemen, did we call them, or something like that? You know,
the Minutemen and
the Crime Busters.
The Crime Busters, absolutely, man. That's their real name. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, he was a real enthusiast. I mean, obviously, a director, it works really well if he's got a strong opinion and he's got a strong idea, and obviously, strong ideas are going to alienate some people, but I felt generally that it was probably about the best shot at doing a Watchmen movie that you could have asked for. And certainly, you know, I've rewatched it a few times. I don't spend a great amount of time, but really for professional reasons, I've had to rewatch it through. And it's not a perfect film. It's got some not so good scenes in it, but it's got some absolutely brilliant scenes. I remember going to a press junket where they showed the bits they showed. I think it was the fight in the jail, and then it was Dr. Manhattan on Mars. And during the Dr. Manhattan on Mars thing, you could have heard a pin drop. It was full of journalists and critics. Everybody was absolutely enraptured by it. And of course, I think most people would agree the real key, the real sizzle of, I'm going to make another meat metaphor now. The real sizzle was the introduction, the credits at the front, where we got those glimpses of the characters. So no, it was. I really enjoyed working with Zach. I've got a lot of respect for him as a filmmaker, and I couldn't imagine it could have been done much better.
I agree. I that opening sequence with the titles and now I remember it was WonderCon back in 2009.
Yeah.
And yeah, I was part of that press junket, and we all ooh and ahhed as Dylan's Times They Are Changing was playing, as you saw from the Minutemen to what was modern day at that moment in the 80s. No, that's an amazing sequence, and really great use of the same music metaphors that you guys used in the comic to actually get the real music there and stuff. Some people were like, "That's too on the nose," and it's like, that's the story. That's what it is.
I mean, I couldn't have been more thrilled that we actually got permission from Dylan's people to use that, and it was slightly remixed for length. And to think that the thing that had in some ways been an inspiration, at least to the very introduction of Watchmen, was now a part of it. And also when we used quotes in the graphic novel, it's really interesting. I don't know this in great detail, but apparently Dylan's people, who we used a couple of his songs, we used Desolation Row, and I think the Jimi Hendrix thing.
All along the Watchtower,
all along the Watchtower.
Yeah.
And they apparently were very reasonable and only wanted a token payment, whereas some of the other people were looking for a payday, which I don't think they got in the end. But it was a huge thrill to be in any way associated with Bob Dylan in my book.
Well, and it's funny mentioning music. I always harangue you about this when I think of the originals, and another great portion of the book, and what a great image here. But all right, I at least got one song from you in your description of your time as a mod in those late 50s, early 60s times, and Dobie Gray's In Crowd. And it's interesting because I would have thought maybe more Ramsey Lewis's jazzier In Crowd.
Oh, yeah. Although the actual line is in the Dobie Gray one, is other guys imitate us, but the originals are still the greatest. That was the era of those songs when I was growing up, and I've actually on Spotify, I actually did an originals playlist. I don't know how it works on Spotify, but if you go and look for the originals, I mean, I know there was a Motown group called the Originals at one time, and I know it's connected with Spinal Tap as well. So it's a big joke about the originals, all the originals, and all that sort of stuff.
They were the new originals, yes.
Yeah, but there's a whole genre of things of music which is known in the UK as Northern Soul, because a lot of the clubs in the north of England were really passionate about getting obscure and authentic American R&B and dance music. And in fact, interestingly enough, this is a complete divergence, but it shows how worlds connect. One of the most famous of the Northern Soul DJs was a guy called Ian Levine, who knew everything about Detroit and Boston and all these places that these vocal groups came from. And he was the guy who more or less kept Northern Soul going and, was the leading guy. He recently sold his comic collection. He had a comic collection. And what his comic collection was every comic that DC had ever published. All the Golden Age superhero stuff, the war stuff, the romance stuff, everything. He had everything that they'd ever published. And I don't know whether he thought, right, I've completed my collection, now I'm going to sell it. But he did sell it off, but that would have been something to see. And again, there's this weird kind of fandom crossover, because the whole Northern Soul thing was almost like a kind of dance music fandom, and so it's just a particular mindset. You want to collect things, you want the obscure things. And again, to beautifully bring it back to the book, I wanted to take people back to the real esoteric and real close-up stuff that explains my love for comics, and I'm sure that hopefully that will be shared by a lot of the people who will enjoy the book.
Mikey G wanted to know, will there be more stories with the originals or something similar?
Well, that's funny, because I go around telling people, and I believe it to be true, that I'm semi-retired now, if not completely retired. And, I've worked in this business for 50 years, which is amazing to think it's been that long. and I've drawn so much. I've drawn so many pictures, so many characters. How many ears have I ever drawn? How many hands have I? You know, when you start to think of it.
Sure.
So I gravitate much more these days towards writing, which is why I've really enjoyed doing this book, and you know, doing scripts for other people as well. But there is one little loose end from the originals. And I was talking to a good friend of mine called Pat Mills. He was one of the leading lights behind 2000 AD. Wonderful writer, huge influence on the way comics have gone. And I was telling him about this and about my idea for a sequel. And he said to me, Dave, you're going to have to write this. You will be haunted by it until you write it. And just in essence and briefly, and you know, not to give the whole game away, when I was a mod back in the day, I was at college and everything, and I used to work at the weekends and holidays, you know, school holidays, in an old folks' home. And I was like an orderly, and I'd be serving up the meals and getting people showered and shaved and everything, all these old guys.
Yeah.
And they used to tell me some wonderful stories. Like I'd sit them in the bath, and while they were giving themselves a wash over, I'd sit and look at the paper or something. Or they'd start talking, and they were a generation that had fought in the First World War, that had been in France in 1914, 1915.
Wow.
And when they got going, they would suddenly start to tell me wonderful things, wonderful stories about them, their experience as a young man. And they ceased being old men. They just became like men or boys or humans. And like their voices would change. There's a wonderful thing. I'm going off on a big digression here, but there was a wonderful radio series, which I'm sure you're familiar with, called A Prairie Home Companion by Garrison Keillor. And in one of those episodes, he was talking about conversations he'd had with his dad. And he said, I didn't hear my dad speak in his real voice very often, but a couple of times when we were sat out on the porch, staring into the sky, drinking a scotch or a bourbon, his voice would change, and it would become really, it wasn't my dad, it was the boy, the young man who became my dad. And I used to find that with these old soldiers. And it occurred to me that it might be interesting, having seen the characters in the originals when they were young and carefree and thought 18 was a big age to see them when they're old, when they're in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and to see how the power struggle is then. Because when I worked in this old folks home, there was actually a murder. It was like an accidental thing, but this old fellow was tried for murder. He'd had a little fight with a fellow inmate, and one of them had fallen over, bashed his head on the table, and it was enough to kill him.
Wow. And
so I thought you could do something really dramatic with this. And then the other day I was walking around the local town, and of course you have these mobility scooters. I'm sure they have them in the US as well. And I thought, yeah, they still got scooters. They still got with mirrors and lights and everything. So, and the more I think about it, the more I think there's a story there. Whether I would write and draw it, or whether I might just write it, I don't know. But that's something that, as Pat said, is haunting me at the moment. And that may well be the thing that I do next.
Sounds brilliant, Dave. It really does. And I'm so glad you finally did the Spotify playlist, because that's why I'm like, God, man, Warner's has like the rights to probably so many of those mod songs that you loved. I'm like, there's got to be a way. Not even, and I don't know, maybe Spotify hadn't existed the last time we talked about it, but I'm so glad. I'm going to totally seek that out. But absolutely, Dave, I can see a cover. And again, get an artist, write it. It's your story. But on the one side, be the mod in the 50s, and then the same guy riding around in one of those Rascals. I know that's one of the brands.
Rascals, is that what they call it?
Yes, indeed. And it's kind of, there's another ironic, they call it a rascal, but certainly, I was more of a rascal back in 1961 or whatever.
That'd be great. I'm tempted to tell you more about some of the ideas I've had, but I won't. I'll tease you, but I'll make sure if I do write it that you get a credit and that you get an early copy of it.
Well, and seriously, man, you've been generous with your time. I don't want to keep you, because I'm sure you got more things to do. I mean, I'm happy to keep talking. You know that. And I've actually, there is one more image I wanted to show.
Okay, let's do one more then, shall we?
All right, Jethro Tull, man.
Yeah, Jethro.
Tell me about this.
Well, that comes from a British music paper called, I think, The Melody Maker.
Sure.
And what happened briefly, again, this story I tell in some detail, was I got approached by a guy who was an illustrator, and he'd heard that I drew comics. and he was doing this comic strip for a well-known band, and he needed a bit of help to finish it. Would I be interested? And I said, yeah, could be fun. Who is the band? He said, oh, it's Jethro Tull. And I wasn't a particular fan of Jethro Tull. I'm still not really. I said, oh, well, that, but I thought the money might be good. So I went to see this guy. Just put the image up again, John.
Indeed, absolutely, my pleasure.
And so I went up to see this guy in the West End of London, and he had this huge sheet of illustration board. And the picture at the top left-hand corner, which is swiped from a photo ref of Ian Anderson, the singer, and the lead interpreter, this huge sheet of board, all it had in it was that one image. So he wanted me to help finish it off. In other words, he wanted me to do the whole thing.
Wow.
So I thought, well, that could be good fun. So I did it. I said I would do it. And a couple of weeks later, I was working on it. And I got a panicked phone call one night. And it was the manager of Jethro Tull. And he said, are you Dave Gibbons? And I said, yeah. He said, are you doing a cover for the Jethro Tull album? I said, yeah. He said, well, we need to see it. We've seen nothing of it. We don't believe it exists. You know, time's getting really tight. You've got to show it to us. I said, well, you can come around my house tonight. He went, right, we'll be round. You know, I sort of told him where I lived. And I said to my mum and dad, because I live with them, there's going to be a knock on the door in a minute. Let me answer it, because it's an international rock star coming round to see me. So he arrived looking really grumpy, Ian Anderson, really not pleased. And his manager as well. And I remember on my mum and dad's dining table, putting the piece of artwork down and lifting the flap, the protective flap that I had on it.
Sure.
And it was deathly quiet. And in those days, I used to smoke, and I more or less just smoked a whole cigarette in one drag while I was waiting for the verdict. At which point, Ian Anderson turned around, big grin on his face, and went, yeah, I love it. It's really good. Oh, brilliant. Thanks very much, Dave. So it all turned out really, really well. And a friend of mine who works on the local paper got to hear about the local newspaper, got to hear about it, and said, God, you must have got a lot of money for that. So I told him how much I got. And he said, oh, we'll have to run an article on that in the local paper. So he ran an article in the local paper, which was seen by a guy called Mick McMahon, who people will know is one of the absolute brilliant Judge Dredd artists, fantastic illustrator. And he lived in the next village to me, and we got in touch, and we've been friends ever since then. We used to share a studio. We're actually going to meet up in a few weeks. So it's weird how things spin out. But yeah, so, and that particular thing you just showed was they obviously really did like the drawing, because that was done for the center of the gatefold album. But they actually ran the whole thing as a double page ad in the Melody Maker. So it was one of those jobs that at the beginning looked what they call a little bit dodgy, but actually turned out to be one of the most useful things I ever did. There you go, rock and roll.
You know, that was I had an older stepbrother, and his date for this Jethro Tull concert in 1978 fell out. I was like 13, and he's like, please, I don't want to eat the ticket. Go to this thing. And I'm like, but I don't like Jethro Tull. I barely like Bungle in the Jungle, and I'm not interested in Thick as a Brick or Aqualung. And man, there were a lot of flute solos in that concert.
Oh, yeah.
But it was fun. And, Ian Anderson, you can't help it. The pageantry of him dressing like a pirate and dancing around. My God.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it was just a bit more towards the kind of hippie end of things. Like, from the music I loved came British R&B and British progressive rock. But I was still much more down the Motown, dance music. I had time for the Small Faces and the Who. But
I saw that in the book, yes.
Really, that flowery underground finger in the ear folk singing stuff didn't do anything for me at all. But he was a nice guy in the end, Ian Anderson, and I think they did a reissue of the album recently on a special CD edition. I think I was interviewed for it, and they printed in that as well. So it still survives even after all this time.
It's funny, prog rock really evoked a lot of the same sci-fi and fantasy imagery of comics of the era. And, so yeah, it is. But I am kind of with you. And it's funny, I stumbled on 2 British-made documentaries about prog rock where even from Emerson, Greg Palmer from Emerson, Lake and Palmer was interviewed. And even they seemed a bit embarrassed by their 10-minute indulgent songs that went nowhere and everything,
and of course it did lead directly to punk and the Sex Pistols and everything as a sort of backlash against this
response,
flowery kind of music, so self-indulgent kind of music.
Indeed, things righted themselves. Well, Dave, as always, man, I love our tangents. I hope you do as well. I mean, we talk about it from snooker in previous conversations and some of the weird stuff that we've talked about.
I always love to talk to you, John, because you always leave space for the meanders and the dives down the rabbit hole and everything, which is, I think, where hopefully you find some of the more interesting stuff. So yeah, always a pleasure to talk to you. And if I do my sequel to the originals, I'm sure I'll be back to talk about that.
Please, Dave, and I hope I never want to bother you too much, but I am always so appreciative that you come back, because I love what we talk about. And truly, everybody, the great thing is many of the tangents covered you will find in Confabulation, this wonderful new autobiography, already available in the UK. It should be in early March coming to the States. Amazon will have it by the 14th. And yeah, if Dave is I'm assuming Dave's getting his dates from Dark Horse, and it sounds like maybe by March 5th, it'll be on the U.S. Market. And that's great. It is so wonderful, Dave. I'm so pleased that it came out as, it sounds like you're happy with it. I know I am. And I know Pilcher probably is as well. So
no, it's great. I'm really grateful for the positive feedback, John. And you've now read the whole thing from cover to cover, have you?
I haven't.
Good man.
Loved it. I mentioned Brian Bendis said it is one of the best comic books about comics in a long time, and I so agree. The anecdotes, the memories of not only your collaborators but the people that inspired you, and just a wonderful look at your art over the years, and the different skills you bring to the parodies as much as the hard sci-fi and superhero stuff. It's just great.
Well, thanks, and I appreciate Brian's positive comments about it as well, because he's a guy who knows his comic books. So that's much appreciated, Brian, if you're out there.
Well, thanks, Dave. Everybody, thanks a lot for watching. Tomorrow afternoon, another daytime word balloon. I'll be talking to Jeff Lemire. So another portion of the United, I don't even know what you guys call it. All the different countries that are part of it.
The Comics Confederation of the World.
Well said. Of course. See, the always eloquent Dave Gibbons. Everybody, thanks for watching. It's going to be Jeff Lemire tomorrow at 1:00 Eastern time. So until then, stay safe, stay happy, stay healthy.